Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating historical mystery. How on earth did an entire country like England lose its mythology? You know, we all know about Greek gods, Norse gods, but England's own ancient stories? They've pretty much vanished. Let's figure out why.
I mean, seriously, think about it. You can probably name Zeus, Apollo, maybe Thor and Loki without even blinking. But what about the gods of the Anglo-Saxons? What were their big, epic sagas? The very fact that you have to stop and think so hard about it, well, that's the whole point. Ireland's folklore is famous all over the world, but England's own native stories are incredibly hard to find, so we're going to dig into why that is.
And you know, this wasn't just some minor thing. This cultural loss was felt so deeply by some people. Get this, J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote The Lord of the Rings, he called the Norman conquest and the cultural black hole it created the biggest shame in English history. That loss was actually a huge part of why he wrote his books. He was literally trying to build a new mythology for England because he felt its original one had been destroyed.
Okay, so to really get how an entire mythology can just poof, disappear, we've got to go right back to the beginning. We're talking about the Anglo-Saxons, the people who first settled England. And right from the start, there was a huge vulnerability in how they kept their culture alive.
You see, the entire cultural library of the Anglo-Saxons wasn't stored in books, it was stored in people's heads. Specifically, in the minds of these amazing professional storytellers they called skeptics. These guys were the living, breathing hard drives of their culture. It was their job to memorize and perform this massive collection of stories and songs in the courts of the nobles who paid them.
And this is where you see the core problem. If you look at Gaelic Ireland, you had literate Christian monks who, for whatever reason, got interested in the old pagan myths and decided to write them down, which preserved them forever. But in Anglo-Saxon England, nope. The tradition was almost entirely oral. It was all spoken, nothing written. Plus, the Anglo-Saxons were relative newcomers to the land, so their stories weren't deeply tied to specific hills or rivers. All of this made their mythology incredibly fragile from day one.
So you've got this very delicate, spoken tradition. What happens next? Well, it gets hit by a series of devastating historical events that one by one just systematically took apart the very things that kept it alive.
And these weren't quick hits either. This happened over centuries. You have this sort of 1-2-3 punch. First, the conversion to Christianity, then the Norman conquest in 1066, and finally the Protestant Reformation. Each one of these major events targeted and destroyed a different, vital part of England's mythological ecosystem.
The first blow was pretty straightforward: replacement. As the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity, their old creation stories and gods were just swapped out for Christian ones. New laws actually forbade worshipping the old gods, guys like Woden and Thunor. And the monks, the only people who were writing things down, they had zero interest in preserving what they saw as pagan nonsense.
Then came the absolute knockout punch, 1066, the Norman conquest. The entire English-speaking ruling class was kicked out and replaced by a new French-speaking one. And these new French nobles, they had absolutely no interest in paying for some old English bard to sing stories they didn't know or care about. So the Skoppics, they lost their jobs. Without patrons, they just vanished. And that whole unwritten library of myths, poems, and songs, it died right along with them.
And the silence that followed this was, well, it was profound. For 200 years after the conquest, English just wasn't really used as a written language. Think about that, a 2-century gap in a culture's own story. It's a massive black hole, and so much was lost in it forever.
Okay, so centuries later, the final religious blow lands. The big epic mythology was long gone, but some folk customs, the stuff of everyday people, had managed to survive. But then came the Protestant Reformation, which attacked these too. Things like Morris dancing, May Day celebrations. They were suddenly banned as papist idolatry. Basically, they were seen as too Catholic, and they had to go.
So at this point, the beliefs have been replaced, the storytellers are gone, and the local customs have been banned. The final blow was against the last thing holding it all together, the communities themselves and their connection to the actual land.
This started way back. As early as the 16th century, a series of laws called the Enclosures Acts let wealthy landowners just fence off common land that everyone used. This completely shattered rural communities. People were forced off the land their families had lived on for generations. And when they left, the stories tied to that specific hill or that weird old tree were severed and forgotten.
And this whole process of displacement, it happened all over again, but on a massive scale during the Industrial Revolution. People were pulled out of the countryside and packed into factories and cities.
And those close-knit, multi-generational communities you need for folklore to be passed down from a grandparent to a grandchild, they just broke apart. So, when we ask where England's myths went, the answer isn't one simple thing. It wasn't a single event. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts, happening over more than 1,000 years.
So to wrap it all up, it was basically a perfect storm. You had a fragile oral tradition that was never written down. Then the Norman conquest got rid of the storytellers. Then powerful religious movements actively suppressed the old beliefs and customs. And finally, huge economic shifts destroyed the very communities that were the last keepers of these stories.
And you know, this whole history leaves us with a pretty big question for our own time. In this era of ours, with such rapid change, with globalized culture and everything being digital, what stories, what traditions, what little local mythologies are quietly fading away right now, maybe without us even noticing?